Selecting a commencement speaker is no easy task. What we look for is someone who might understand very well what we're doing in the School of Communication at Loyola. We're trying to combine a great education and important, timeless values with skills that will help students compete in this fast-changing digital world in which we live. This brings me to Claire Diaz-Ortiz, a woman who lives on the cutting edge of technology, yet she herself personifies dedication to timeless values, values like making a difference for good in the world. Ms. Ortiz is the leader of social innovation for Twitter. She's been named by Fast Company magazine as one of the most creative people in business. She's the author of Twitter for Good, Change the World, One Tweet at a Time. In a nutshell, she goes around the world teaching people how to use social media for good. You may or may not know this, but she helped teach the recently retired Pope Benedict to tweet. She holds a BA and MA in anthropology from Stanford University and an MBA from Oxford University, where she was a Skoll Foundation Scholar for Social Entrepreneurship. Ms. Ortiz is the co-founder of Hope Runs, a nonprofit organization operating in AIDS orphanages in Kenya, and she herself spent a year working in an orphanage in Kenya. She's an amazing example of how one person can strive to change the world, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Claire Diaz-Ortiz.
So before I talk, I want to give two warnings. The first warning is that my hat may or may not fall off during the course of this speech. If it does, let's pretend it didn't happen. My second warning is that this speech is longer than 140 characters. If you use Twitter, you know what that means. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. It is a true honor to be here. And one of the reasons it is such an honor is that it wasn't that long ago that I was at my own commencement address. 10 years ago, I sat in your shoes. It was a hot day in California, and I listened as my commencement speaker told me about some of the things that might happen to me in the years to come. Some of them did happen. There it goes. Some of those things did happen, and some of them didn't. But the main thing I learned that day from that speaker and from other speakers I listened to at other graduation ceremonies in the years to come was that the best thing a commencement speaker can do is tell you what she has learned and tell you her story, and hopefully something that she has learned will help you at some point in your journey. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you 10 things that I've learned in the last 10 years, one thing for each year separating me from you. And the first lesson I want to share is probably the lesson that most guides me and most will always guide me. And that first lesson is to don't always do what they tell you to do. When I graduated from college, I didn't listen to the well-meaning advice of career counselors and on-campus recruiters. And instead, I moved to Mexico because a bad book told me to. The book was about a middle-aged couple that went to a small town in Mexico to retire, and I was 22. I wasn't middle-aged or retiring, but I believed that the book spoke to me. So I decided to go to the same small town in Mexico. I had a really pathetic job, and everyone asked me what I was doing there, and I said, well, I want to be bored again. I want to hear myself think. And so after a year, I was sufficiently bored, and I knew that it was time to do my next thing. And that was to spend a year traveling around the world. Now, in this period, I didn't have much money, and I wasn't thinking much about money. And so that was how accidentally I learned my second lesson, which was to not make it about the money. I have a lot more responsibility on my shoulders than I did when I was 22 and 23, but I'm very grateful that I took the chance and took advantage of the freedom I had then. And I hope that as you go forward in your career, you consider that balance between freedom and money. As I traveled around the world, I started a blog. And that blog started to get popular, and as many thousands of people came to it to read about me getting altitude sickness, trying to claw my way up to Everest Base Camp, and me doing nothing on a beach in India for a month, I realized that as much as I loved blogging, I had this huge dream that I needed to accomplish, and that was to write a book. But I didn't know how to write a book. I certainly didn't know how to write a book proposal or get a literary agent or do any of those things, so I did something, and I learned lesson 3, which is, I think, lesson that many of you have probably already learned to get to the success you have today. And I learned to not be afraid to Google my dreams. I Googled how to write a book. I did. It worked. It's worked a couple times. You can Google your dreams. On the last stop on my trip around the world, I went to Kenya to climb a mountain. Someone told me about a guest house near the base of this mountain that was free or nearly free. And since in that time I did anything if it was free or nearly free, I decided to stay the night at this guest house. It turned out that the guest house was owned by an orphanage. And when I arrived, the orphanage elders asked me for lunch. About half an hour into that lunch, I excused myself to go to the restroom and wash my hands. And as I stood in that restroom washing my hands, there was a small mirror. And for the first and only time in my life, God showed me my future. I spent the next year living at that orphanage. I started a nonprofit organization, and I never climbed the mountain. I still haven't. And that was how I learned lesson 4, to always keep your eyes wide open. As you go forward, I hope that you remember to keep those eyes wide. By the time I left the orphanage a year later, a lot of things had changed for me, and that was how I learned lesson 5, which was to hold plans loosely. I had been surrounded by all these snotty kids living in the loudest apartment I would ever live in my life on the ground floor of an orphanage of 200 children. And somehow I had grown up a bit. I decided that I wanted to go to business school, and I was trying to figure out a way to be a mom to a teenage Kenyan boy I wanted to bring back to the US. The next year, I found a way to make that happen. We were too close in age for me to adopt him, and so I stringed together pieces of magic and various opportunities to get able to bring him to the US to start high school. And that was how I learned lesson 6. Opportunities are always there for the taking. They're just not always obvious. At business school the next year, I thought a lot about my career and what I wanted to do next. And as soon as I decided what it is that I wanted to do, I hunkered down and went after it. And that was how I learned lesson 7, that intense focus can sometimes yield intense rewards. And this is surely something that many of you are going to confront in the years to come. I got a job at a startup in Silicon Valley, doing what I was passionate about. And for the next 4 years, I excelled at lesson 8, which was learning to say yes. I said yes, and yes, and yes. And I was lucky to be on the ground floor of a rocket ship as it took off. Twitter, which was a company I had come to love when I first started tweeting in that Kenyan orphanage, eventually came to be loved by many. But saying yes too much can also be a problem. And so the next lesson I learned was a particularly hard one. As I wrote books and worked too many hours, I realized that some pieces of life were actually passing me by, and that I had to learn lesson 9, which was to learn to say no. When the world is so bright and shiny, we want to say yes all the time, but if we want to be bright and shiny in that world, we have to learn to say no. And so I hope as you find what you were meant to do professionally, you look for that balance between yes and no. And all along this decade and this road of finding balance and finding what I wanted to do, I started to learn the most important lesson of all, and surely the lesson that I'll be learning for many, many decades to come, and that was lesson 10, that you should always be you. I'm different than I was when I sat in your shoes 10 years ago, but only marginally. still love breakfast burritos, and I'm still a terrible introvert. After this talk, I'll probably fly home and not talk to anyone for 24 hours. At my core, I am who I was when I was sitting in your seats. And in 10 years, you will be, at your core, the same. So go ahead and learn the lessons of the next 10 years. Always be you as you do so, but try everything and make mistakes and make the next long, short, crazy, fast, slow years the best years you've ever had. Because then, when you're standing here at 32 and you wake up in the morning and you think you just saw your first gray hair and your blonde head, you'll be happy and excited about the next 10. And then the 10 after that. Congratulations.